to start off, let's find some common ground and talk about Black Lives Matter as well. You're a proponent of the movement. So maybe why don't you just lay out your argument of why do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement is helping the Black community in America, and yeah, what's their biggest strengths, etc.
Yeah. Well, the Black Lives Matter movement, if I remember correctly, started around 2015, I want to say. And in the time that they have been active, they have organized a large number of protests fighting for change. And they are also, I guess, ground zero for a lot of other major social movements. Even when we saw the protests, the March for Our Lives protests, you know, things like that. Black Lives Matter activists were very linked to that as well, because they're fighting for change. And I wouldn't necessarily say that things have gotten significantly better since they started. But important steps have begun to happen. It's a long process, the process of social change. And we're starting to see, especially in this most recent round of protests, right, with George Floyd and everything that's happened, we're seeing a spike in awareness and a spike in public support. So I think that while, I guess it might be fair to say, it might be fair to theoretically say, I'm not sure how much like help they've been doing. It's because like we haven't hit that turning point yet. And we're approaching it very soon, as their protests begin to really catch on and generate a lot of support.
Yeah. What's for you the main theme, I almost want to call it? What are the major core aspects of the Black Lives Matter movement? So what is Black Lives Matter actually fighting for in your eyes?
Black Lives Matter is fighting for, I guess, two major things. The first thing, and perhaps their largest or their strongest fight at the moment, is the ending of police brutality. Yeah. And their second, and I think more long-term goal is to address racial-based class disparity through reform and stuff like that. They do fight for a lot of like social programs and stuff like that.
Yeah. And also something we talked about last time was that the whole Marxism argument where the founders claim themselves to be Marxists. Do you see that as a major aspect as well of Black Lives Matter, that they kind of have a communist agenda to some degree, or is it for you not a core belief of the whole thing?
Yeah, like it's clear that Marxist ideals influence their approach and their goals, but so much as anyone who is wanting to use social programs to address class disparity is going to be influenced by Marxist ideals. And then also in their structure, they have a very decentralized structure, which is very anarcho-Marxist. And so, yes, but my concern is oftentimes when people say like they have a communist agenda, they mean like communists are trying to take over the country and claim it for the USSR, you know? And that's not I think that is very far from the truth.
Okay. Another thing that I'm interested in is with talking about the problems of African American communities. Do you believe that police brutality is kind of one of the, or you said police brutality and the other one just general class disparity between those communities and white communities. Do you think that those are at the core of their problems? Like, are those the biggest threats to African Americans in America? In America.
Yeah, kind of.
Okay.
I would say that the largest threat is probably the increased white supremacist activity in the past 4 years.
Okay.
And that is a significant danger, but it's also those aren't issues that can necessarily be solved with protests, because like, what do you do with an increase in white supremacist activity? There's not much so I think that they're addressing the things that they are most able to address, not necessarily the largest threat, which is the fact that there's an increase in people who might want to hurt them.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. This is, I guess, where we start to disagree a little bit, and I'm going to tell you in a second why. I had another question that I just was going to ask you. Yeah, then let's just get into that. Because for me, I think, from my perspective, and this is, I don't know, do you know Larry Elder?
Not sure I do.
Okay, he's he's a conservative Black American. And he is very vocal, criticizing Black Lives Matter. So the arguments that I'm going to bring up are kind of in his regard. So if you don't, for anybody listening that doesn't like any criticism of the movement by a white person, then go listen to Larry Elder, and it's going to be a black guy asking these questions. So kind of what he opened up for me, or what he told me about, or what he's posting in the internet is, if you look at what we also talked in episode 1, the whole police brutality thing, and I think actually one of the biggest realizations for me in episode 1 is when you brought up that we talked about police incompetency, that is obviously a very big problem, and we agreed that kind of African Americans, they are the ones that suffer the most from that incompetence, and that is something that actually was kind of a wow moment for me, where I was like, yeah, well, that just makes a lot of sense. And something I don't think we talked about yet is what's your stance on violence in Black communities? Is it reasonable for you to say that there's more violence in Black communities, and what do you see as the reason for it?
I will say that there is more violence in poor communities because poverty begets crime. Crime is often violent. There's more. What was the word we were just using? Violence. Thank you.
I have full understanding. English is a hard language.
There's more violence in poor communities, and Black people are disproportionately poor compared to white people in America. Now, I will say that the danger comes when we use that without also analyzing the fact that even if that was only the reason, even if that was the only reason that Black people were being hurt by police, then we would also see poor white people hurt at the same rate. And that's just not really something we see. Or when we do see it, white people it's much easier to get reconciliation for a white person than a Black person in America. It's part of how our justice system is enforcing the problem of police brutality. So while yes, kind of, I don't think it's necessarily a fair descriptor to say like Black communities so much as poor communities, but Black people are the ones being affected.
Okay, well, Larry Elder in his kind of his argument centers around yes, poor communities. Actually, I think the biggest predictor of violence is not having poor communities, but where you have the biggest disparity between rich and poor. Like that's apparently where you get the most violence. If there's a poor community that sees the rich people as well. Let me lay out Larry Elder's argument here for a second. He brings up some numbers just where I was shocked when I first heard them. So if you look at the time since George Floyd died or was killed until Jacob Blake was shot like a couple of weeks ago, in that time frame in African American communities in America, there were around more than 2,000 people were shot by other Black people. Those are the numbers that he brings up. It's around 7,500 homicides a year in Black communities. And that number is just mind-blowing to me. I don't know if you had an idea or if you know that number or if you had a number in mind for that.
I mean, I've heard numbers thrown around before, but continue for now.
Okay. For me, the problem is if for me as an outsider, it seems reasonable that there's a few cases of police brutality. I think per year it's about 10 African Americans that are shot unarmed by police, and those are tragic cases. The George Floyd was probably the most. That was just crazy. Kneeling on a person's neck for 9 minutes. We don't have to talk about it. For me, the problem is that also happened in the past with white people as well. I don't know if you've ever heard of Daniel Shaver, of Tony Timpa, which was, I think, 5 years ago or something like that, where a very similar case happened, where a police officer was kneeling 13 minutes on this guy's neck and he died as well. There's a few other names I don't remember right now, but police brutality, we don't disagree. The problem is if we focus, and especially in the last months, it was these two instances where everybody went on the streets and screamed Black Lives Matter, which they obviously do. I don't know. Have you ever met somebody that argues that Black lives don't matter? That's kind of...
Nobody that I've ever respected.
Okay. Have you ever met people that argued for it?
I did know I had somebody who I once acquainted myself with who turned out to be outrageously racist.
Okay.
And that's about as far as I'll probably go into it.
Okay, yeah, fair point. For me, it's just...
yes, he would have said that.
Yeah, fair point. And I'm not saying there's no such people. White supremacists are very real. There's racists that, we don't have to talk about it. I think that's very valid points. And everybody that tries saying that I will stand by your side and fight them with you. There's no, not even a doubt about it. For me, the problem is, especially just bringing up the argument that 7,500 Black people are shot every year, and mostly by other Black people, that is a racist argument by itself. Where for me, it says, yes, these instances where a white police officer brutally kills a Black person, yes, those are tragic as well. But especially in the George Floyd case, those police officers are arrested and hopefully they spend the rest of their lives in jail, as they should be. The problem for me is, why can we not talk about the 7,500, or in the case since George Floyd died, the 2,000 other Black people that have also been murdered? Why is it racist to talk about those and see that as a real problem? Why is the only Black lives that we can't talk about or are allowed to talk about the two that were killed by the police? Why do the two matter so much more than the other 2,000? That's kind of the main argument that I just don't understand.
Sure. Before I say anything, quick segue, I guess, for anybody who happens to be listening to this podcast. I want to make it clear that the purpose of this podcast, Stefan and I talking, is to begin a dialogue between opposing sides. Normally, when it comes to the Black Lives Matter discussion, I would want to hand off these conversations or point people towards resources already been provided by Black folks who have been doing the work for much longer than I. However,
And
because
just
of the
if I
nature of
can
this
interrupt for a
podcast,
second, same thing on this side. If you rather have this conversation by a Black person, I would advise you to listen to Larry Elder or someone. Just yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I wish I wouldn't have to talk about this, but I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions and not a lot of respectful conversation. So I thought that I'd love to have this conversation with Alex, even though we are white, and I hope that's okay. Please continue.
Sweet. So the problem with the Black on Black crime argument, and the reason it gets denounced as racist, while I don't think it necessarily has explicitly racist intent, right? Like, I don't think what you're saying is you trying to detract from the Black Lives Matter movement, really, or the issue of police brutality, I guess I should say. The reason it becomes an issue is because Black on Black crime is not disproportionately higher than white on white crime in the same circumstances, right? Okay. And that extends beyond, like, it's something like 90%, I don't remember the exact statistic, but like somewhere around there, high 80s, low 90s percent of crime are committed by someone of one race to a person of their same race. Crime almost always happens within the community that somebody's in, right? So like, if I'm going to commit a crime, it's way more likely that I do it against you. Well, not really, because you're in Austria, but that I do it against you than against, you know, somebody who's living in like downtown Cleveland, right? Like, I'm never downtown. So that I make that point in saying that Black on Black crime or white on white crime, right, is just crime, right? Like, it's not like it's this other systemic issue like we have with police brutality, because the issue with police brutality compared to something like crime, right? Because obviously we want our crime rates to be down. We don't want people killing each other, right? And we can talk about that issue, but the police brutality issue is incredibly different, because crime is inevitable, especially when you have class disparity, right? Especially differences in money where some people are struggling to get by, right? Like, we have gangs, right? Gangs exist because gangs exist in poor communities. It's not like when I go to some rich suburb, there's a bunch of gangs like roaming the streets, right? So my point, police brutality is a failure of the state. It is the state killing people, and Black people disproportionately to white people, right?
I wouldn't necessarily agree that it's disproportionately killing them. The study that I brought up at the end of last time, I looked up the name, but now it was Roland G. Fryer, who was a Black professor at Harvard. And I quoted it wrong the last time. I'm sorry, I'll be more careful in future. What he found out was not that whites are actually more likely to be killed by police officers, but that he couldn't find a difference in how fast a police officer shoots somebody. That was kind of the finding of it. For me, the problem I have with this argument of police officers killing more Black people or being more violent towards Black people isn't that kind of in the, as we talked before, isn't that in the, as we already said, that in poorer communities and in Black communities, there's more violence. So doesn't it make, in a way, sense? I don't want to make it make sense, but isn't it expectable that in communities where there's more violence, that there's also more police violence in a way? I'm not saying that any of the killings or anything is okay. I'm like, every instance has to be looked at. But isn't it kind of expected that the communities with more violence will be met with more violence, kind of?
Yes. And you're not going to find people at Black Lives Matter arguing against that point. They're not going to argue.
I wouldn't say that necessarily. You can find people arguing for pretty much anything today.
Well, right. But I mean the actual, like, the organizers, the people actually running. Okay, yeah, I don't mean just your random Joe Schmo who's right. They're not going to argue with you there, right? They're not going to argue with you and say there's going to be an increase in police violence in situations or in areas that are more violent, right? Like, because obviously. However, the issue is a little broader than police violence, right? Because like we're seeing with Breonna Taylor, right? With Breonna Taylor, the people who killed her still haven't been arrested. And it becomes almost background noise at a certain point where everyone's just saying, arrest the people who killed Breonna Taylor, arrest the people who killed Breonna Taylor, right? But like, that was extremely unjust what happened to her. And then the fact that her boyfriend at first was arrested afterwards, who still didn't commit a crime. The problem is broader than just the police brutality itself. It's the response that then happens afterwards. It's the fact that the police, especially when they are killing Black people, oftentimes escape unscathed, or if they get fired, they oftentimes are able to get rehired at another police station.
And that is a problem I fully agree with. Things like that shouldn't be happening. And I don't remember who said this, but there's a certain, well, let me just say this. For the whole police brutality aspect of Black Lives Matter, I will sign right away and I'll say something needs to be done. For me, the problem kind of is, why is nobody protesting when a police officer brutally kills a white person? Why is it not? I don't see really the difference. Isn't that just as unjust as it is with a Black person being killed?
Yeah, yes, it is. And the counter argument to that is twofold, right? Okay. It is both, yes, that's unjust, and yes, we should be doing something about that as well. Like the Black Lives Matter movement is not, let's only stop Black people from getting shot by police, right?
See, it feels like that sometimes, though. I gotta say, at some point, it really feels like if white people are killed by the police, it just doesn't matter to them. I don't know. Maybe that's an unfair statement it's a feeling, but did you hear about a lot of cases where Black Lives Matter like spoke out against police brutality against white people as well? I haven't heard of that.
So it's actually been part of a recent conversation. Okay. But let me, I guess, extend what I was going to say a little bit. The reason the outrage isn't as severe is because it doesn't, or according to, because I mean, obviously you have statistics that you pulled, and it's not like they are acting without statistics. They have statistics they cite all the time. I just was not prepared enough to have them pulled up with me. But they too have statistics, and their statistics say that Black people are killed at a disproportionate rate, right? And
I think that makes sense again. Like, for me, it's just not in how far is it because there's more violence in those communities. Like,
right. But I guess my argument is it's not that they don't care, right? Like their fight to end police brutality is a fight to end police brutality against anyone, right? It's
Okay.
not like they're like, let's get the legislature to pass a law that says you can't kill black people anymore, right?
Yeah.
So, um, well, I mean, obviously that's already a law, but they don't see that it's the same systemic issue, right? So they're focusing their efforts, or I shouldn't say it's not the same systemic issue, right? Because it is, because people are being killed by police officers, and that's not good. People
Yeah.
are being killed in situations when they should not be by police
And
officers,
it shouldn't matter what the skin color of that person being killed is. If they are unjustly killed, that should get outrage and
right.
they should be arrested. Period.
Right. The issue and why you see them fighting most often for black people, or almost entirely for black people, is not because they don't care about white people, but because they feel like black people are being disproportionately affected, and that they are not receiving justice at the same rate as white people.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's more just a focusing their efforts where it matters more than like um, them not caring about white people.
Yeah. Okay, let's go back to the so the police brutality argument. I guess we seem to be on a pretty good page there. Like police brutality, has to be certain changes in the system. Yeah, no discussions there. Your take on defunding the police or abolishing the police? Just real quick, I think we also pretty much agree on that, as we already talked in episode 1.
Yeah, I put forth in episode 1, in case anyone, I guess, skipped episode 1. I put forth in episode 1 the idea of decentralizing the police force, instead of completely abolishing, like minimizing how often they're used. And I think we need to, in my opinion, especially as we're seeing the influx of white supremacist groups, like I said, per the FBI, we're seeing the influx of white supremacists in the police force. We need to quote unquote abolish, but it's an abolish and replace situation where we replace it with smaller policing forces used for like violent situations, and tied to their communities, and then using social workers and stuff for other situations where a police officer or somebody with a gun wouldn't necessarily be needed or appropriate.
Yeah, but do you agree that we would have to first set up these other systems before we can just abolish the police right now?
Right. Like, I'm not saying we, go through a couple months of lawlessness before we put a new system in.
I'm glad we have that covered. Okay. Then let's get back to the other topic of black on black crime, which for me, so you said basically for you, the reason is that there's more black communities, and that's why, and violence happens more in in poor communities. That's why we see more crime in African-American communities. Let me lay out Larry Elder's argument here real quick. Mm-hmm. What he says is, so there's white communities as well that are poor. I don't know the numbers between comparing poor white communities comparing to poor black communities. That's actually something, if you have some statistics there, please send me. I'd be very interested in looking at those. What Larry Elder lays out is a different kind of cause of the issue, and I would love to hear your opinion on it. What he says is, well, you're familiar with the argument. Probably it's the single motherhood issue, and this is something what Larry Elder argues happened since the 70s and 80s, where these welfare programs started, basically telling single mothers in black communities mothers in black communities that if they are single, they will get a shit ton of money from the state, and to kind of bring money into those communities. And what happened in the last 50 years in that case, according to Larry Elder, is that the single motherhood in black communities went up from, I think, around 25% to now over 70% of black kids growing up without a father. And the argument he always brings up at this point is that Barack Obama once must have said this, I think, in his second term, or maybe in his first term, because in the second term he kind of changed his opinion. What he said is that a child growing up without a father is, I think, 5 times more likely to drop out of school, 12 times more likely to end up poor, and 20 times more likely to end up in jail. So that has nothing to do with skin color or money. It's just them growing up without a father. And if you look at the numbers, if 70% of Black children grow up without a father, and any child growing up without a father is 20 times more likely to end up in jail, I don't know. For me, that seems like a very reasonable argument. I don't know if you've heard of it. What's your take on that?
Yeah. Let me begin by saying that the issue of children not growing up with both their parents is something that I take very seriously, and is especially, and I should extend that even further. I'm going into social work to work with children. Like that's my career that's my career goal. Like that's what I want to do. Yeah. So let me, I guess, make it abundantly clear. I am not minimizing anything of what you just said.
Okay.
Now, I will say that the phrase that I'm sure you've heard, correlation is not causation, comes into play here. Because, and I think it's seen in the argument itself, right? Because we're saying, now, I will say there is an issue with the welfare system where it does enforce or it does encourage single parenthood. Yeah. I acknowledge that, and it's something that it's a difficult situation because it's either, because you want to support single parents, right? Like you want to give them the extra support they need, but at the same time, how do you do that without encouraging it? Yeah. So it's, like you have to find a very delicate balance there. But with that said, we're seeing, because that's a system really often created by welfare, which is used by people who are poor, a lot of those issues, while I'm sure might be made more difficult, without having a father, a lot of those issues are poor issues, right? Like, like increase in like crime and like ending up in jail and like difficulties in school, like those are very specific to poor communities, especially. So while not having a father might make it worse, those statistics aren't purely caused, I wouldn't say, by not having a father. A huge part of that is being poor.
Okay. Well, I guess our major disagreeing point then is what really causes the violence in these communities. Is it single motherhood, which for me, 20 times more likely ending up in jail without a father seems like a pretty crazy... yeah, for me, I feel like there's some causation there for sure. How much is probably hard to find out. But I guess our major disagreeing point is then that you think it's more simply that because these communities are poor, that's kind of the main reason why there's more violence, and that kind of, brings about more police brutality and them more suffering from the incompetence of police. Whereas the conservative kind of argument is more that it's not... And I'd love to see the numbers, but I'm not 100% sure of if white communities really have as much crime as poor white communities really have as much crime as poor Black communities. But the single motherhood issue seems to be a pretty big, even though it's also becoming worse and worse for white people as well. I think it rose from like 5% in the 70s to now 25% of white people also growing up without a father, which... Yeah, I think that's a discussion for another day, also about masculinity, etc. If masculinity is just evil in itself, or if there could potentially be any positive effects of being a man or having a man in the household. That's a different conversation. But I guess this is kind of then the crux of our disagreement. For me, why are we not more talking about the 2,000 Black people that were shot and how we could go about changing that instead of just focusing solely on the police brutality issue that cost 2 lives in the last few months?
That's a fair question. And let me say, before I tackle that, I want to bring up, because this will tie into what I'm about to say.
Yeah.
I want to bring up, you were talking about how you still think that the single parenthood issue is a cause for a lot of these things. And I guess my argument, though, is the single parenthood issue is still caused by social programs that people are on when they're poor, right? So just like you're arguing, maybe we should address a root cause more, like addressing the issue of crime, because it'll help negate, it'll even help negate the amount of police brutality, right? Because like if police are called less often, then they're going to have less opportunity to be violent.
Makes sense.
And I think that applies to the other argument as well. Like you're going to have less single parents if we have less poor people. So like it's like we can kind of address. We can kind of do a 2-in-1 addressing economic disparity rather than focusing on, like you're arguing with Black Lives Matter, the smaller, more focused issue. So I guess, this is something that I mentioned way back at the beginning of our conversation. Black Lives Matter, they are fighting long term for addressing economic disparity, and you can even see it. Like if you look, I follow the Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter Cleveland page. Both of them run very differently, let me tell you. And they talk all the time about some of the things they're fighting for beyond just addressing police brutality, right? And so much of it hinges on addressing how poor people are in America, or like the bottom, the lowest classes in America. However, the reason they're focusing on police brutality is because it's a very immediate threat, right? And it's also, to some degree, easier to address and gain support for, like, maybe police shouldn't kill people versus, like, maybe we should, like, restructure our entire economic system. So that's their fight, and they're fighting it. But that's a more like long-term goal and something that they're like laying groundwork for, as opposed to the fight against police brutality, which they're fighting on a more immediate front.
Yeah. One problem I have with the police brutality, or like just the narrative of Black Lives Matter as well. If I look at LeBron James, for example, which I love the NBA, I love him as an athlete, absolutely amazing. But I don't think it was with George Floyd. I think it was a few years ago, but when also a Black person was killed, and he posted something on Twitter like, Black people are literally hunted every time they leave the house. You can't even go for a jog and you're killed by police. And my question with that, even if you look at George Floyd or Jacob Blake, I don't want to say that their shooting was in any way okay, even though with Jacob Blake, we could have a conversation about it. With George Floyd, there is no discussion, absolutely. It is still, in most of these cases, it is not that a innocent jogger is just walking from going grocery shopping and is then killed in the back for no reason. Especially with Jacob Blake, he was a sexual offender. He has pulled a gun on people in the past. He has attacked policemen in the past. I just think the narrative that Black Lives Matter kind of pushes, that as a Black person, you have to be scared about your life every time you leave the house because police officers are out to hunt you and to kill you. Are you sure that that is a good narrative for Black people to have, and to scare their children into being afraid every time they see a police officer?
Oh, okay. Let me say a few things, I guess. First of all, I want to address the Jacob Blake issue because it's a conversation that we see a lot surrounding Black Lives Matter.
I don't really see conversations happening. I just see outrage at another black person being shot. The details of the shooting kind of don't seem to matter anymore. It's just another white person that shot a black person. That's kind of what I see. I don't know if you experience it differently.
I was raised in fairly conservative Ohio.
Okay.
So in Ohio, and with a lot of being Facebook friends with a lot of conservative folks, I think I'm probably seeing a lot more of the other side than than you might. So I see this conversation come up a lot. The issue with the argument, I guess, is that Jacob Blake, that could not have been known by the police officers, right? Like his past history, it's not like they, ran him through the database.
Are you sure about that? I'm not so sure about that. I think wasn't it known that he was there and they ran his ID? I don't know. Maybe this is something I was misinformed, but
or perhaps I was misinformed. I was,
but I'm not 100% sure. But I mean, I listened to also conservative sources, and they just, I mean, for them it was clear. I don't know if anybody actually checked it, but for them it was clear that they were aware of who he is and of the dangers that he posed in the past, I guess. I'm not sure though, and I guess it's not the most important aspect of it, but it is
yeah. Yeah, fair enough. I might have been misinformed as well because I didn't think that they had. I thought that they had tried to arrest him because he was on the scene of the two women fighting, and then he tried to, quote unquote, escape because he didn't do anything, and that's when he was shot. However, that was more of a tangent. What was your main question again? Oh, right, LeBron James.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure, and I could be wrong, but that LeBron James comment sounds very, very similar to the Ahmaud Arbery situation.
Yes,
did you hear about
I think
that?
might be the name. Yes, I think so.
So what happened with that situation, and that was near the beginning of this most recent rounds of protest. It was, I think, the first major one to hit the headlines.
It was a couple of years ago, wasn't it?
No, it was earlier this year.
Oh, that was this year as well. Okay.
He was jogging through his neighborhood when two white dudes who were in their house saw him, and they called the police, and they were like, hey, there's this guy running through our neighborhood. We think he's up to something. And the police are like, okay, we'll check it out. And they're like, no, we're going to follow him. So they hop in their truck and grab their rifles, follow this jogger, and shoot him and kill him.
See, that's where this is an interesting point, because the story that I have heard from Larry Elder, this black guy that kind of fights these issues as well, is that apparently that this was kind of the narrative that everybody was talking about, that, but apparently, what was his name again? Ahmaud Arbery, is that
Yeah.
Right? So he was actually on these properties that he was around. He actually apparently was stealing the days prior already certain, I think it was kind of a construction site or something, and he was stealing machines or something. And when the police got there, he wasn't just jogging around doing nothing, but he was again on these people's property and like lurking around. And I'm not saying that gives you right to shoot somebody just outright like that, but it's a very different narrative if you're jogging or if you're a thief coming back to the site and kind of trying to steal something again, or checking out your the places where you want to steal something. I'm not saying that the murder is I don't know enough details to say yes or no, that's okay or not, but the narrative is very different if it's a jogger or if it's a criminal. And again, with George Floyd, even though he should have never been killed, like there's no question about it. But it's still a difference if I'm just shopping or if I'm called for some kind of a crime. And with Jacob Blake, it's again a different story. He's a sexual offender that has attacked people or police officers in the past, and people or the police officer are telling him, like, I don't know how many times to lie down and then point their guns at him, and he just doesn't care. And for me, I'm not again, like, I have to make this very clear. I'm not saying that these murders are okay, but we have to be careful of the story that we tell, because if you're if you're a black American that's kind of going on about your life and living a good life, you shouldn't be and you're listening to police officers' instructions. There's a very, very, very small chance that you are killed unarmed or for no reason. There is a chance, like we saw with Breonna Taylor, etc. That those are instances that are very tragic. But are black people hunted every time they go jogging? Is that something that you would stand behind, that argument?
No, but it's hyperbole for the sake of like, it's not like, and let me, before I tackle this, I want to make sure that the Ahmaud Arbery thing is discussed properly.
Okay.
Because he was not stealing things. That was a claim put forth by the men who killed him. They said there had been a string of robberies in the neighborhood, and that they thought he was the person who did it. But then when people looked into it, investigators and reporters looked into it, there had been no reported robberies within the past 2 weeks. So nothing had been stolen from the neighborhood. So the men had created a reason to hunt down this man, right? So while sure it is a different situation, but also, you know, vigilantism is not necessarily a good thing either. But yes, it is a slightly different situation when somebody, quote unquote, brings it on. Though the extra argument that a Black Lives Matter activist would throw at you is that stealing is not a death penalty.
Absolutely.
Right.
And there's no we don't have to discuss that. I would absolutely agree.
And I think that part of the huge problem that we've seen recently is that a lot of these cases have been unjustified, right? Because we have Ahmaud Arbery, we have Elijah McClain, who was on his way back from the gas station, like just walking to his house when he was killed. Now, Elijah McClain, I'm not sure if you heard about him, but
I think I've heard the name before, but I don't know any specifics about it.
Elijah McClain was known by everyone like around him that he was like this kind of quirky, but like he was like a pacifist, like he would refuse to hurt anybody for any reason. He played violin for the Byrds or something. So he was like a huge, when that happened, it was like a huge thing because it was like all accounts of his life were like, this guy's a perfect person, right? And he was still killed by the police. And you can hear there's audio of his arrest where he's it was a very similar situation to George Floyd, where they had him in a chokehold that eventually strangled him and killed him. You can hear he in the audio, he's apologizing to the officers, and then he goes, "I forgive you. It's okay." Wow. Like he starts forgiving them, like truly just an incredible person, right? Still killed by the police officers. And then even George Floyd, right? A lot of people liked, because George Floyd had a past criminal history, right? And because the officers were responding to a call about a forged check, right? There likes to be justification made. However, there's a lot of skepticism on that.
And I gotta say, do you know of any like reasonable people that have said that the guy that killed George Floyd should be free. Like, I don't think that with the George Floyd case in particular, there's nobody that argues that that this killer should not be in jail.
Right.
I mean, there's people, as we said, there's people for every opinion, but nobody reasonable would argue that that was okay, I think. Like,
right. No, and that's not my point so much as my point. My point is more in that with George Floyd, it appears again. The situation looks very much like George Floyd went to the store, wrote a check, the check bounced, tried to leave, right? It wasn't like, because like forging a check is like, what? Like, if a check bounces, it bounces, like, bummer, I guess. Yeah. I'm pointing out situations where peaceful people, because George Floyd, I mean, if you talk to people who know him or who knew him, George Floyd massively turned his life around. He moved in order to change his life. And that's why he was in a different city. He had a job. He was like working as a bouncer, and he was investing in his community. He was going to church, right? Like he was a very different man from the man who robbed a store years ago, right? But even these people who are like quote unquote peaceful people, right, who are good people, are still leaving, and or not even leaving. I mean, because you mentioned Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor was sleeping in her boyfriend's apartment. We have all these situations, and that's why the hyperbole is used, right? That's why, and it's a reasonable. It's easy for us to say as white people that that's not a reality, right? But we have to consider how it must feel to constantly see people being killed by police officers and to experience racism often in your own personal life, and then to have to leave. Like, how must that feel to interact with police officers, or how much do you think of police officers at that point?
Yeah, that's a very fair point. I don't know. Have you heard about Daniel Shaver? That's kind of the only white person I kind of know the backstory about. I think it was like 3 or 5 years ago. I think actually in Arizona. Heard of him? So he was this white guy working for like basically a gardener, and he had this rifle for shooting birds like on this property that he was working at apparently. And somebody saw him with this like, what do you call it? Like what do you call it? Like those small rifles that are not like big caliber or anything, just like for I don't know what you call it. Like a very small, not a toy rifle, but like for birds and not like with something super serious. But somebody saw him with this rifle in a hotel in Arizona and called the police on them. And what happened afterwards, like there's videos of it where this police officer just screams at this guy for supposedly having this weapon. And what happens is over a couple minutes, he gives him like ridiculous orders of crawling towards him and not moving and well, he shoots him at the end for the way it looks in the video for no fucking reason. The problem is it was a white guy. So it seems like this is not as much talked about. For me, in all of these cases, from Breonna Taylor to Ahmaud Arbery, I hope I say it right, George Floyd, Jacob Blake, do you really think that all of those were racially motivated in cases, or was it, as we talked about in episode 1, kind of, was it just police being incompetent and Derek Chauvin being an asshole, like as a person? Is there any evidence that any of these killings have been racially motivated? That's kind of my question, I guess.
I would say very few of these killings have been explicit, right? Explicit racism, like, all right, like, I don't like black people, so I'm going to kill them, right? Now, with Derek Chauvin, it is incredibly likely that was perhaps something personal, because they worked together, they knew each other. But I would say a lot of it is not explicit racism, but implicit bias, right?
Yeah.
And that's really the argument. The argument is not that people are running around when LeBron James. Now, I should say, for anyone listening to this, I'm from Cleveland, and in Cleveland we love LeBron. So, like, I'm never going to talk bad about him unless I talk about
Fair.
Miami, I guess.
Fair.
But LeBron, um, he clearly said something jazzed up and angry, right? And he was using a lot of hyperbole. It's not really a true belief that police officers are running out and hunting Black people, right? But it's that feeling that Black people have. It feels like that because of the implicit bias, right, against Black people. And I think the easiest way to see that is with Ahmaud Arbery, even though they weren't police officers, right? The ones who killed him weren't police officers, but I don't doubt that they thought he was up to something bad, right? But I think that it was implicit racism that led them to that belief. He was just a Black guy jogging through the neighborhood, since it was a predominantly white neighborhood, or a nearly entirely white neighborhood, they were like, he doesn't fit here, like he's not supposed to be here, and their belief then was that he was doing something wrong. So I don't think that a lot of these cases are so explicit, but I do think that implicit biases have a huge factor in it.
Okay. So I guess we agree that the police brutality is a very big problem. We kind of disagree where the violence in the communities come from. I think where we started this specific discussion though, so why you laid out all these arguments for these handful of cases that were all tragic. But again, why can we not talk about the 7,500 Black people that are killed every year through Black on Black crime, just because it's not as easy to get like support for it? I'm not sure if I'm fully convinced by that argument. That was kind of your major argument, right?
Sorry, I misargued a little bit.
That's okay.
My point was that's the reason it's not being addressed by the Black Lives Matter community at this moment, and that is a more long-term goal, because it has to be, right? Whereas something like police brutality can be addressed in a more immediate sense, theoretically. The reason people get upset when you bring up Black on Black crime, right, is because Black on Black crime doesn't really happen at a significant difference to white on white crime in the same circumstances, right?
That's where I don't know the number. I just know that for young Black men, it's actually the like first, or the highest reason for death reason, I don't know what you call it, is homicide. And I think the numbers are for every 100,000 people, and I think I got this also from Larry Elders, one of Larry Elders, what he mentioned. In 100,000 people, I think 4 or 5 white people commit a homicide or are killed. For Black people, it's somewhere around 23, I think. So I'm not wholly convinced that those numbers actually add up, because clearly there's a lot of poor white neighborhoods as well, and I'm not sure if that's all just due to the Black communities being poorer at such a large scale.
Sorry, can you run those numbers by me again?
Out of 100,000 people, it was that white people commit a homicide or are killed. I think 3 of them, calculated up to 100,000. And for Black people, it was 23 that actually commit a homicide or are killed by a homicide. So about 6-7 times as high. And I don't know if those numbers add up with just neighborhoods. Let me see if I
Right. So I'm looking at numbers here, and this wouldn't address all of it clearly, though. Um, Poor communities are broader than impoverished people, right? Like a poor community, being poor doesn't necessarily mean you're living in poverty, quote unquote, in a legal sense, right? But when it comes to poverty and race, Black people are 20.8% impoverished, and white people are 10.1%.
So that's about half in that case, which
Right.
for me doesn't really add up to the whole difference in violence.
Right.
I unfortunately don't have I'll send it to you later where I got these numbers from, and I'll add it in the YouTube comments as well, just for everybody to look at.
And I would have to wait, hold on. I'm seeing much different statistics. This is 27.2% of Black Americans, according to the U.S. Census. Anyways, it still doesn't totally make up for the numbers, right? I don't know. I guess it's something that I'd have to look at more, right?
I guess,
but the reason,
maybe we just both look at those numbers again, and also because for me it's also the difference in the if it's. I think the big point where we both are not so sure is it caused by being poor or single motherhood or something else. But finish your argument. Maybe we just take this as a first episode, and then we talk again next week or something, so we can
we do
the
like
numbers in
part two.
specific again and look at the studies. But finish your argument, please.
Yeah, my point is really more the reason people get upset when Black on Black crime is brought up is because it's often used to distract from police brutality or from other larger issues, right? And I'm not saying that you're doing this, but I'm saying that oftentimes large proponents, especially, and we see this a lot, it's used by racists a lot. Whether or not there's validity to the argument, I'm not saying. I'm saying that racist people use that same argument in order to distract from police brutality, right? And that's why it's difficult to bring it up right now, because to a certain degree, it's guilt by association. And I guess my advice, if you want to talk about that issue, you have to broaden it to more than just Black on Black crime, right? Like, because that is singling out a race. You have to broaden it to just be talking about, well, let's figure out why we have crime issues, right? Like, why do we have, let's tackle why we have crime, and then let's address crime. Because I guess your argument really is that crime is taking a large amount of lives, and we need to be addressing crime, which is fair, and that's a good argument. Like that. However, it's a separate argument to police brutality. Like, they can be both together instead of one or the other. And most of the time when people talk about it, and I'm not saying you're doing this because you've said repeatedly that police who kill people should be arrested and charged.
Absolutely. I'm all for police reform. We can do whatever. It's just,
right.
For me, what I kind of disagree there, what you said was that we should focus on bigger issues. For me, it's not clear how 5 Black people shot by police a year are a bigger issue than 7,500 people being shot per year. I don't see how that. I see how it's harder to change, I guess. I mean, yes, that makes a lot of sense, but still, it just seems from an outside or from a conservative viewpoint, it seems like you're focusing on solely the black lives that are killed by white people, which I now guess I kind of understand why you do it, but it's racist to talk about all the other lives. So it kind of seems not genuine that you actually mean that black lives matter. The only lives that matter to you seem to be the ones if they're killed by white people, even though the other numbers are like 1,000 times higher. So that kind of where the ingenuity kind of feel comes on, where it's racist to talk about 7,500 black lives, but yeah, everybody has to talk about the other 5.
Right, and that makes sense. And I hope I am clear in that I do care about those other lives, and that is a huge, because I mean, we've talked about how we have differing opinions on where these increased crime rates necessarily come from.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a huge part of why I care about poverty, right? Like why I care about wealth disparity. It's not just because I want people to have money, but because I want to address the issues that come with not having money, right? The difference is that crime is almost like waves in the ocean to a certain degree. You know, it's like yeah, there are storms, right? And storms make the waves bigger and will, you know, probably crash a few ships. And we should advocate for people to avoid storms, right? We should tell people like, hey, let's avoid these storms. Like, let's not, you know, sail our boats into storms. But it's a very different issue when captains are sticking bombs in their ships and just blowing up everyone on board, you know? And it's just like this different issue because crime is, it's not, it's so like untargeted, like crime just kind of happens. And I'm all for addressing the issues that cause crime to happen. But like, but I guess, this is what I should say. I am very often, most often in favor of tackling core issues, like going as low as possible, tackling the lowest possible issue, and everything will fix itself, right? It's my same argument, and please, whoever's listening to this, please don't misinterpret what I'm about to say. It's my same argument. It's my same argument with abortion, right? Because whether or not you're pro-life or pro-choice, right? There's a very easy way, without even tackling that legislation, to minimize the need for abortions. Like, you don't need abortions if people are in situations where they need them less. Like, obviously. And a huge part of that is poverty as well. We see that there's a huge increase in abortions in situations where people don't think they can provide for a child, right? So it's that same issue here. And also sex education, you know, limiting unwanted pregnancies, stuff like that. But it's the same thing here. Talking about the crime, right, and talking about black on black crime and stuff like that, it's so untargeted and unspecified. And how do you do that without just increasing police presence in these neighborhoods, right, to crack down on crime? But then you're going to have a huge increase in police brutality, right? So how we would do that then is by tackling a core issue. So if you were to say, I want to address the issue in our social programs that seem to support single parenthood, right? Or seem to encourage single parenthood, because I shouldn't say support, because we should support single parents.
Yeah, yeah.
That seem to encourage single parenthood, right? Or you say, I want to address poverty. Those are things that will do what you want them to do, right? Like if we tackle those issues, we're going to see a decrease in crime rates, and we're going to see a decrease in like the murder of Black people, right? But we're doing that without the racially coded language of Black on Black crime, and we're doing it without the racial focus, or the, and we're also doing it without pulling away from the police brutality argument.
Yeah. I think kind of what you just said there at the end with the racial coding, I think that's kind of hard in a way, because I mean, Black Lives Matter, I think at the core of Black Lives Matter is this division of Black, dividing between Black and white. And actually something, two things I'm probably, well, there's so much to talk about. One of the most or the best phrases I've heard about this was in Martin Luther King's speech in when was it? I Have a Dream speech, where he says, "I dream of a world where my children will grow up and be judged not by by the color of their skin, but by their characters." That for me is, that's such a powerful statement, because in my opinion, and maybe this is some racial bias or I don't know, but in my opinion, skin color shouldn't matter. Like skin color is it's a tiny fraction of what makes you a human person, and skin color shouldn't matter at all. And what happens with this Black Lives Matter, etc. right now, I feel like skin color is becoming more and more an issue, and everything today, everything is about skin color. What's your take on that? Are we really moving in the right direction to really end racism, or are we kind of making racism worse than it has been before?
That's an interesting question. I will say, the ideal world is a world where skin color does not matter. Yeah. And by and large, most Black Lives Matter supporters are going to agree. There are a few people who still follow the separationist ideology, especially prominent in the 1960s. Other civil rights leaders, those who are not Martin Luther King Jr., very much pushed for a separate country for Black people. They wanted Black people to leave the country and like form their own community. Because they didn't think that true equality would ever be achieved in America. They were a little more pessimistic, I guess. But most people will agree that our ideal world is a world where skin color does not matter at all to anyone. However, it is, and I try to avoid using this word when I'm talking with conservatives, because I know that it can ruffle feathers at times. But it's our privilege to a degree as white people that we are able to just not think about the color of our skin, right? Because I don't think about it. But like, I know I've got a really close Black friend. Should not say it like that. But I've got a, and he feels like watched in stores. He feels targeted oftentimes. He feels like people treat him differently, all because of the color of his skin. So it's a little but I understand your argument in that should we then bring that to the forefront? Like should we either A, be so bold in how we talk about race, or should we say, or should Black Lives Matter have started with something just like lives matter, right?
Or against police brutality or something like that.
Right. And I think the reason is because they feel targeted, right? So, and they're trying to win over people that they feel like don't really feel like Black Lives Matter, right?
Yeah.
It's more of a response than anything. It's like they've been told Black lives don't matter, so they say no, Black lives matter. It's not so much. It's not so much them just pointing themselves out for no reason. Though, does it create a stronger divide? Is a good question. We see an increase in reactionary content or people.
And I think I've seen statistics that in the last years, when you ask white people and black people how they stand to the other race, apparently like the numbers of them kind of having a good feeling about the relationship between black and white people, they've actually increased in the last few years. So I don't know if I said that right. So the satisfaction with the relationship between black and white people has actually decreased over the last 5 to 10 years. So I think in like the early 2000s, it was somewhere around 80. These numbers are a guesstimation, but around 80%. And now it's, I think, somewhere below 50% where they actually have a feeling that there's a good relationship between black and white people in America right now. Mm. And it's just one of the concerns I have with making everything about race. And I've been reading White Fragility as well, this book, and I don't know. It seems like what you say with the ideal world, nothing would be about race. But here's this whole book that says everything is about race. That if you're white, you are a racist. If you're black, you can't be a racist. And I don't know. That's just such a divisive. It's such a divisive mentality where I don't think how this could ever lead to an end of racism. Like, I don't see that happening in this way.
Yeah. The perspective is that that in order to solve imbalance, you have to look at it, right? That's the argument, really. It's that if you're going to fix the issue, you have to look at it and talk about it extensively. Yeah. And the fact of the matter is, there is. Oh, have you watched 13th?
I have not, but I've heard of it. Is it?
I highly recommend it. It's on Netflix.
Yeah.
It does a better job than I ever could of addressing just in a very simple sense race disparity in the judicial system, right? And it talks about how modern prisons are essentially the way that we have enabled slavery to continue in America.
By the way, that's a different topic where I'd be in full support. Like, there's too many black people in jails for stupid issues like marijuana. It's just, yeah, right. Like there's no discussion like that. Those things we can absolutely talk about and we should have changes. But for me, it's just, that's again something that Black Lives Matter, in my opinion, is not really fighting for. They're fighting for specifically only for those lives that were lost due to white police officers. I mean, that's how it feels, at least. I think you made a pretty good point today that those are kind of the cases where you can get the most support and where it's kind of the most on the surface where you can get the fastest kind of change, because it's literally the state killing people. And I think you made a great argument. Any last words from you? I think then we'll just close it for today.
Yeah. What was I saying? I had something to say.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're good.
Maybe let me just first, and maybe it comes back. I just want to say that this has been absolutely awesome, because I feel like you really like came into this conversation trying to believe that I'm not a racist, which is kind of,
Yeah.
if you would have thought that from the beginning, it would have been a very different conversation, and we would have ended it after 5 minutes, because the arguments I bring for, as you said, racists also use these arguments. For me, I don't feel like a racist. For me, skin color shouldn't matter. For me, it just feels like these points that I made should be able to be made. And I love it if it comes to people like you, who then kind of, we can have a reasonable discussion, and you say, I see your point and I see it's a valid argument, but here's why kind of we have a different perspective. And from my perspective, I learned a lot today. I would love to have a discussion about this again. Maybe we can bring in some more people as well, and lay out the arguments more in detail. But for me, this has been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for the understanding for my arguments, and that you believe me that I come from a well-intended heart and not from a racist perspective. Thank you for letting me make those arguments. Any
yeah, for sure.
Side there?
And yeah, I'd say thank you for also approaching it honestly, but also for never. I don't feel like either of us really backed down on any of our stances per se, but I kind of appreciate that sometimes. Having a good conversation where we can both walk away having learned, but like also still overall being relatively similar in our stances. You know, I just like talking without having to like change my whole life.
And I think it's just, and this is why I think this podcast could be important, because if more people could sit down with, I mean, on a lot of issues we agree. I think that we have to deal with police brutality, etc. That we should help Black communities. Like, there's not even a discussion about that. But there's certain aspects where we obviously disagree, but that we can still sit down and have a respectful conversation. I don't know. That's just very powerful to me, and I hope more people can start to do that, and maybe some of them will listen to this and maybe see some new perspectives on the issue.
I also want to encourage anyone listening to this, because I know that this is such a hotly discussed issue. Like, we're talking about very prominent issues in today's society. Please, if you disagree with something, let us know. Like, yes. I want to comb through some like comments and like learn some stuff. And if you think that we're like absolutely stupid and that neither of us have any idea what we're talking about, that's entirely possible. Yes. And you don't even really have to waste your energy explaining it to us. You could even just like be like, hey, look this up. You know, and then we'll look it up and hopefully learn a lot. So I just want to,
Yeah, very good point. For me, there's one point that I want to mention regarding critiques. I would love if people say, hey, you guys are underestimating this or this issue. For me, like the major part of any critique is criticize ideas, not people. So don't say Alex or Stefan is a racist and they're fucking idiots. Say it, hey, I think this idea or this argument could be better, or there you have to look this up. As you said, look up this statistic or whatever. That's awesome and fully cool. I think this is what makes a good conversation, that we're both willing to learn, and not our main focus is not to win the argument. And I think we did a decent job at that. And yeah, we'll definitely have more conversations like these. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.